thank you so much for joining us and taking the time out of your perhaps very busy day or not so busy day these days to talk to us. So I thought we'd start off by talking about your education and like how you got the information that you needed to do what it is that you do. So
Sure.
can you talk about like what your education has been, formal or otherwise, in order to gain that skill set?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of an old adage, but education starts at the home, and I feel really, privileged to have grown up in the family that I grew up in. It definitely shaped my whole future. My father is a research scientist. He specialized in artificial intelligence way back before it was a thing. And I have an older brother who's sort of a computer whiz, computer genius. And so I would watch my brother program straight machine code when he was 8 or whatever, and I had no idea what he was doing, and most humans wouldn't either. He wrote the first open source BBS software pre-internet, and he was making thousands of dollars as an 11-year-old selling his
Wow.
BBS source code. And people didn't know they were dealing with an 11-year-old. Uh, and so, yeah, growing up in that kind of household, it really shaped me because I couldn't compete with my brother. He was just a diagnosed genius, state chess champion, etc. Very abnormal. And so I kind of turned to, like a lot of younger siblings, I didn't feel that need to really be a provider or anything. So I kind of turned more inside myself, and I think that's why I kind of went towards the more creative stuff. I felt like here's a place where I don't have to compete. You don't compete when you're being creative and doing that kind of a thing. So I really formed an identity of, well, I'm going to be a musician. Music's my passion and my interest, and so I'm going to make that my identity, really. So high school was tough for me. I actually dropped out of high school. I ran away from home. I went through some troubled years, uh, uh, probably partly because of feeling inadequate. And then I went to a secondary school. My parents got me into a private school, kind of for kids with learning disabilities or troubled kids. And that was really a saving grace for me because they had a sort of unique education program where there was a 1 hour a day core class, they called it, where they developed a unique curriculum for every student. And they saw that I had this interest in music, and what they did is they took a closet in the classroom and they turned that into a recording studio, and it was my room. No other student went in there. Had synthesizer, they brought a reel-to-reel 4-track in there. There was a Macintosh SE with MasterTax Pro, so I learned MIDI sequencing. And an hour a day in high school, I did this like being in a studio cave, and it really became, that's what made Steve special, if you will, versus the other kids. That was my thing. And that was pretty much cemented my future right there because for the next 20 years, that's exactly what I did, is hide in a little room and do music with people. So,
That's pretty crazy.
That is
yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, very, very strange journey.
And then you went to college. You have like a composition background as well, right?
That's right. So after high school, it was, where to go. I applied to UC Berkeley, didn't get in there. UC Santa Cruz let me in. I was excited about that because they actually had one of the better music programs, being like a liberal arts college. So yeah, first day of college, making friends, and we all went hiking because it's a lot of nature on the campus. And then one of the guys says, "I'm going to major in physics," and I was like, "Oh my God, that's right. We're not just on a nature hike. We're here at college picking our majors." I was like, "I'm going to major in music." Like I basically that in that split moment, I was like, "That's what I'm going to do." And he's like, "Oh, the placement exam's tomorrow at 9 a.m." And it was like two in the morning. We're out on like a late night nature hike. I'm like, "Oh, great." So I, go in, do the placement exam, placed into the, advanced rank, and then I was sure, like, this is definitely what I should be doing. Uh,
Was your instrument keys? What I mean, so I'm curious about
yeah,
just like what you. Yeah.
yeah. In high school, I took keyboard lessons. I took jazz piano lessons from
Hmm.
a Stanford student, and I took music technology lessons, MIDI lessons, if you will. And this was, pretty early to be doing this, 1988 or whatever. But there was a composer in the Bay Area. He did like Christian television music and stuff like that. And so he would show me how he used Cubase on his Atari and would,
Yeah.
hook up all the gear and all that. So I really got interested and into MIDI and all that in high school. when I got to college, I was like, super into playing piano and keyboards, and I'd do it for hours every day, mostly because that's what's attached to the synthesizers, and that's
Right.
the way you can get into the sound. So I wanted to be the best keyboard player ever, of course, as most teenagers would say. Well, why not be the best, right? So I'd practice 5-6 hours a day, but I started late, of course. And first week of the music degree, I made friends with a girl who had started piano at age 3. She's playing a Rachmaninoff etude behind her back, facing away from the piano, and I was like, I'd love to play that forwards. You know what I mean? So I realized that a piano major is probably not going to be my thing, and so I switched to a composition degree for that reason.
So at that time, who was the best keyboard player in your estimation?
Well, yeah, music's a little funny in that it's obviously not a competition, and I'll actually have a couple stories we may get later too on that concept. But for me, I got into prog rock like Yes and King Crimson and Rush, and it was again my kind of thing. I didn't know it wasn't my parents' music and it wasn't my peers' music, so I really felt like, oh, I've explored, found this like 70s rock that's all muso-y, and so I kind of thought that was cool. And so Rick Wakeman was like my idol, and my jazz piano teacher, I'd bring in the sheet music and say, I want to play his solo, and he's like, this is also like idiomatic trash, and I was like, but it's awesome, it's so
I was kind of hoping you'd say Rick Wakeman's song.
yeah, right. The long hair, kind of the blonde hair, kind of came from that. And yeah, that was my dream. I mean, I would have loved to be just like a showman up there, like just shredding and impressing people. At the same time, even earlier or around that time, I realized it's probably not the thing. And I started having this fantasy where I'd just be like moving knobs and there would be an audience that would be really excited. And they're like, I don't know what he's doing, but it sounds cool. And then, of course, in the future with EDM and DJing, that's kind of what happened. That ended up being me up there with moving knobs that people can't see,
Yeah.
That's crazy. It sounds like there's a lot of serendipity along that journey. It's like, and then I was in this environment, and then this happened to happen, and so then that happened, and then that happened, and it's really quite unexpected in a way. I guess I thought it would be more intentional in some sense.
Yeah, really not. I've always set my sights to a big target. It was like when I was trying to just figure out 15, 16, starting to plant seeds, my mom would actually say to me every week or so, the last year of high school, remember, Steve, you have to love what you do for work because you're going to spend most of your adult life working. And I really only heard the second half. You're going to spend most of your adult life working, and didn't like the sound of that. But that was really what entered my mind when I just on the spot moment said I'm going to major in music, was that I have to love what I do, and even if I don't see the path through. But when I was trying to visualize the path, because everyone knows that music is a sort of scary thing to try to do for a living, and so I was trying to picture the path, and I just imagined myself teaching piano, giving piano lessons in a tiny little apartment above like a little corner bar. Maybe I'd go down and gig with the band on the weekends in the bar. And this was like a little imaginary situation. I was like, I'll be happy. This is all I need. And so that was what really armed me with the, sort of launched me on my like trajectory without a specific path, was like, hey, I'll be happy with very little. I just want to do this stuff for a living. And that really kept my options open. I wasn't like, I need to do this. I wasn't trying to control the universe. I was able to sort of just float with it and find opportunities as they came to me.
Wow. So then what happened after college, like in terms of your formal and informal education?
Yeah, so in college I did a lot of development, of course. There was electronic music studio, and I learned about all the typical audio engineering kind of stuff. And so I was recording bands in a soundproofed garage that we had made for my band's rehearsals. And so I was starting to do a lot of recording, and I was starting to feel what it's like to be a freelance audio engineer. And now this is in Santa Cruz, which is like a surf town, beach town. It's not really a strong economy, kind of a college town. So I had a hard time, collecting $20 from the bluegrass band I recorded. And I realized, wow, this is going to be a really tough thing to like stay in Santa Cruz after college and try to do audio engineering. I don't think this is going to work out. So I moved to San Francisco, which was the nearest metropolis, and I had a contact from a music store I worked at in high school who had started a pro audio dealership called Cutting Edge, and they were the Pro Tools dealer for the Bay Area. And so I hit him up, and he was like, absolutely, and gave me a job. And so I was doing, sales, installation, training on Pro Tool systems right out of college, and that was a really great experience to, I really didn't feel like I understood all the possibilities for my future. And what better way than, to get at my core, which is music and technology, and Pro Tools was really the game in town in the 1990s. And so for, high-end stuff, if you needed a track counter, a lot of plugins and that kind of thing, you needed these big systems. So I was meeting Sega, Sony, all these CD-ROM multimedia companies, which was the big thing in San Francisco at the time. And I was getting to see all the various people that were using these systems for a living, which was what I wanted to be. So it was really great to get that feel. And then that led to me getting poached by Avid, essentially. They told me, why don't you go down to Avid for the day, because you're going to be on the phone with the support crew a lot. And they basically said, would you like to work for us? And I was like, sure. So I switched to work for Avid. And that really just extended that exact same experience where I was on the phones with all the pro products. I was sort of on the pro products division. So I was dealing with the guys with the blown out systems, with the expansion chassis, with all the DSP cards. And that was wonderful because I was seeing all of the high-end people. Who are the people that get to use this stuff for a living? And how are they? And it actually really changed my trajectory because, with a composition degree, I was still thinking maybe I should be a composer. Wasn't really sure, but after being on the phone with film guys day in and day out, they were always the most stressed with deadlines. Like when the stuff wasn't working, they were just freaking out, yelling and screaming, this was supposed to be done yesterday. And then the music guys were like, yeah, I think this card's broken, but we didn't really want to work today anyway. It's kind of a nice day out. Hey, what's it like working at Avid? Is it cool, man? Do they treat you? And I was like, these are my people, these album guys. Like, I want to work on albums. It was sort of sure at that point.
That's great. Were you playing in a band at the time?
Kind of.
Yep.
Specifically then I wasn't. I had actually gotten into kind of like just all of the computer-based music. And so I was making industrial kind of art rock, kind of weird experimental and industrial stuff. A little ahead of its time in a way. But
was there an audience for it? Or was this personal project?
It was pretty personal. If you remember back then, the internet was really in its infancy. I mean, that was around the time I first saw HTTP on a billboard or www or whatever. And man, oh my God, there's a computer on a billboard. So the times have obviously changed from back then. But there was this thing called IUMA, which was started in Santa Cruz as an Internet Underground Music Archive. And it was a couple students, a couple years older than me, who had put up an FTP server at first that just allowed people at different universities to share their music that they were making, and then they turned it into a website once the web started being a thing. My buddy and I, we did like industrial music called Razorface, and we did some release on IUMA when they turned that into a physical CD release. They handpicked some of their favorite artists, and they picked us, which was cool.
Razorface.
Razorface, yeah.
I love it. That's great.
So that was then, and I knew I wanted to get out of the cubicle at some point, and I was starting to make a lot of contacts. I was giving anyone I thought was cool my direct line. Queensryche. Oh, hey, take my direct number. Oh, Nine Inch Nails. So take my direct number. So I started talking to Charlie Clouser from Nine Inch Nails, and finally I was just like, he gave me some compliment once. He called me up on something totally unrelated to Avid, and I knew the answer, and he was like, oh wow, man, you know your stuff. And I was like, yeah, if you ever need someone full-time, and he's like, actually, funny you say that, we're looking for someone. I don't know if it's beneath you, but we need someone to like back up the hard disks every night. And and I got so excited. I was like, oh my God, I could go work for Nine Inch Nails. I'm like, yes. And so sure enough, I flew out there, did an interview, and ended up working on a Nine Inch Nails record called The Fragile for 2 years. And that was like a PhD or a master's degree in of itself, working with Trent and Charlie and all the talent in that building.
I love this story.
What was that like working with, so your role, I mean, at first you said you were backing up hard drives, but I can't imagine you were doing that for that long. What was the working relationship like? Yeah,
it was interesting. I was brought in for that purpose, really. It was sort of like a disk backup, sample slave kind of a thing. And I was like, we really don't need to do this because we can just hook up like a 10 base T network, which sounds ridiculous now, but or 100 base, and we can just have a server run and automatically back up the files off the studio main computer every night at 4 a.m. or something. And they're like, really? You can do that? But won't it mess with MIDI timing or something? I heard Apple talk, and I'm like, no, that's all. We can make this work. So I actually in my interview, I set up an automated system to do the backups, and I was like, you still want to hire me, right?
Yeah, you got yourself out of a job in the interview. You made yourself obsolete. That's
right.
Great.
But yeah, they gave me some samples to chop up. It was like multi-track drums, and I just used quick keys macros to make it all sort of as fast as possible. And then they gave me like 5 days to do it, and I think I did it in 4 hours. And they were like, oh.
This was like time-aligned drums, or it's making samples from them?
This was they went to Steve Albini's studio in Chicago and recorded a whole bunch of one-shots, and then they wanted those to be able to be sliced, but keep every single microphone as its own file, but they all need to be named so they're correlated. So we have these correlated folders, and then we were sending those to a rack of like emulator samplers to fire off multi-channel drums. And so, yeah, it was something like maybe 1,000 drum hits, but then when you multiply that by microphones, now you have 18,000 files, and then there's all the naming. But they didn't really know Pro Tools. I knew Pro Tools, so I knew some tricks, and then I knew some other tricks like quick keys to sort of do macros for you, so you don't have to do, type the same key combinations over and over. So I just had it sitting there, just tab to the next event, record that, tab to the next event, record that, and so I wouldn't have to sit there and bounce anything, and then all the naming was automatically handled by the track naming from the internal bouncing. So they thought it would take days, and it only took hours. But yeah, so I show up at the studio with all of my gear, because I had been collecting gear since I was about 15. So I had, Kurzweil K2500, Genelex, PCs, Nord Lead, you name it. Like I had a bunch of, or Nord Modular. Anyway, it wasn't out yet. We actually got the first Nord Modular on that record. But so yeah, Trent sees all of this influx of gear coming into the studio, and he was like, "Oh, you have a K2500. Oh, why don't you make me like 100 piano sounds?" I'm like, "Okay." He's like, "Yeah, just spend a couple weeks and just try to make some fucked up, like whatever you can do." And I was like, "Great." And so it was just sort of instantly catapulted into it. I just if there wasn't some task for me to do, Trent would sort of just assign me something. He'd be like, "Here, why don't you mess with Reactor came out or whatever? See if you can make me some fucked up drum machines or something." Okay, great. And spend a month, wiring up weird drum machines. So it was like a dream come true. I mean, it was always something I had kind of wished to have, which is the camaraderie of not just being isolated alone working on music, but to sort of have these various rooms where different people are doing different things. Yeah. That was kind of always the vision of what I thought would be the coolest job. I imagined it like a composing house. I didn't imagine it quite as cool as Nine Inch Nails, but it happened.
The story keeps getting better and better. So how did you get from Nine Inch Nails to Xfer Records?
Yeah, it was a strange trajectory. When the record finished up, Trent asked me if I wanted to like go on the road with him and take photos of the band and upload them to the website every night. And I didn't want to. It was kind of a hard thing to turn down because I was young and single, and going on the road with Nine Inch Nails seems interesting. But I was kind of like, I'm really here for studio stuff. If if there's bands coming through, I'll stay here at the studio and work with. And he was like, no one's coming through. So, well, I guess that's the end of your employment. And I was like, oh well. So at that point, I, the record was finished, and so I decided to move to LA because where else do you go if you want to keep working on records? I mean, I was bit by the bug going from cubicle with angry people in your ear to working on a Nine Inch Nails record. It's like you can't just go back to the cubicle. Yeah. Like, hey, how was those 2 years? And it's like, no, I can't just go back. I need to try to further this. And I did, of course, know that Nine Inch Nails would probably be a decent calling card for me. So moved to LA, $1,000 to my name, maybe 2 phone numbers, and just kind of lucked out. Those 2 phone numbers both led to a dozen or so records of work. So I had no problem finding work at the time. 1999, and knowing Pro Tools and stuff really well was a blessing because Pro Tools was becoming this industry standard on all albums, but the producers were sort of an older generation, and they didn't really want to sit there and be a computer operator. They want to be on the back of the couch or at the console. So all of a sudden, this sort of new section of budget was appearing on records for a Pro Tools operator, and so I had no problem doing that, finding work record to record for a few years there. Did quite well at it. I could work an album for 6 weeks and then take 6 weeks off or whatever. So,
And that kind of work, is they're still recording to tape and then transferring to Pro Tools and back and forth? Are we in that kind of moment in music technology and recording in the studio?
not so much. Most of the producers, there was definitely still guys that would be doing that. Yeah, most of the guys kind of at that point were like, well, tape sounds bad in general.
Yeah.
Tape has all these issues, but I like the sound of tape for drums or something like that.
Right,
so
right.
people would sometimes track drums to tape and then bounce that in, or just print through to tape or something. But yeah, for the most part, no, it was straight Pro Tools, and that was interesting because tape still had this, or still does for that matter, have a sort of a myth about it where people think that digital is bad and analog good, and like and then there's people out there that kind of furthered that, like Steve Albini made a statement, something about how Pro Tools ruins records. And
well, that's one of the reasons I asked, because you had mentioned Steve earlier, and I know that about him, so that was my
Yeah, it was interesting. So in LA around that time, I don't know if this still happens, but there was the Recording Academy out in, I think it's Tucson or somewhere. Forget where it is, but they basically had 100 or 200 students that they would make them go intern in LA. In other words, they had to do an unpaid internship, which is actually illegal now that I think about it. California has labor laws that prevent that. But they would intern at studios. And so pretty much every record, I worked at this one studio in particular, and every record there would be a new intern. And there's a couple of them. One in particular, I remember he would just like, when the producer left, who was a very esteemed producer in rock, Dave Jordan, who's done like Jane's Addiction and Offspring and Alice in Chains, Dirt, and all that. And so Dave's got quite a pedigree as a record producer. And here's this young 19-year-old intern going, why doesn't he use the tape machine that's in the corner? He's using Pro Tools when he has that machine right there. Steve Albini says,
Right.
Pro Tools ruins records, and what's the stupid end? And you're like, okay, kid, I'm sure he'd use the tape if he wanted to use the tape. But it kept kind of going over and over with this kid, Steve Albini. And so if you fast forward, kind of skipping timeline, but in 2005 or so, I had made this drum software called BFD with F-Expansion, which is like a multi-channel drum, and I had done all the sound recordings, and then we were looking to do some expansions. And then I thought of Steve Albini, because I was like, what would be better than to get sort of that, go to his studio and record with him as engineer? That would be such a cool product or add-on for BFD. So I went and did that with him, and so flew out to Chicago and rented a Pro Tools rig and brought it in his studio. And so it was the first time that Pro Tools had been in his studio. And he was a little begrudgingly like, hey, okay, whatever you want. I'm just he has a very kind of just no nonsense white collar. I like his ethos a lot. And it really I really figured out all the mystery once talking to him, because he's also very forthcoming with information. So anyway, his assistant was like, hey, Steve, this G5 tower is really quiet. And he's like, be quieter if it was off. and so I was like, I gotta ask you, I'm just curious, are there any sonic properties to tape that you find desirable? And he said, what? No, absolutely not. The goal of a recording engineer is transparency. You're supposed to capture the sound in the room like a fly on the wall. And I was like, interesting, because to me, digital is transparent. And if you're not looking for any sonic property from tape, then why the hell would you use it, right? So then my next question was, well, why tape, right? And he's like, I'll tell you, there's two main reasons. Number one, and it's probably the most important to me, is archival. You give me any magnetic recording made in the 20th century, I don't care if it's 2-inch, half-inch, quarter-inch wire, you give me a week, I'll find a machine and I'll get that to play back. And I was like, well, interesting, but isn't digital superior for archival? Because you can make duplications with no generation loss, and I don't get, if archival's your thing, then digital's got to be superior. And he's like, well, you try to open your Pro Tools session 10 years from now with missing plugins, and you see how that goes. And I was like, well, if I cared about archival, I could bounce everything out as bar1 AIFF files, and now I've got the ultimate. And he's like, yeah, but you don't. I'm like, oh, okay. so anyway, that point was kind of lost on me. I was like, I'm not going to chalk you up a point for archival.
Yeah.
But then his other point, which is super valid, especially for his, scene, punk scene and all of that, is, the dynamic changes when you can fix mistakes. People go, oh, move my note a little later or earlier, or, oh, copy my performance from the first verse to the second verse. And he's like, that's not how music's supposed to be. You're not going to play the same bass line on the second verse. You're going to do something slightly different. And so I have to give him credit that that's a really good point, that there is a downside to the technology making it able to change anything and make this recording. If it's supposed to be a performance, it's no longer a performance when you iron out all the mistakes.
Yeah.
And so me being an electronic music lover, I don't give him a point for that personally. I wasn't about to go buy a tape machine to make some techno, but nonetheless, I think that's a valid point for bands, and there's something to be said for just making people play their instruments and capturing it.
I agree.
We have conversations about that quite a lot lately, actually.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about, we were going to ask you about MPE later, but this whole idea of like a performance being uneditable in some way, or limiting the amount of editing that you can do and just playing it. It's like we're like almost swinging back around to the technology being like expressive to a point where you can't even handle all the data, right? And so maybe you just play your instrument and you play that performance, and that data is not supposed to be edited, or I don't know. I guess.
Yeah, there's a time and a place for that for sure. I mean, I got into albums specifically. Like, I wasn't too interested in being an engineer in live sound. In fact, I've never been terribly interested to going to concerts because the fidelity is so compromised, and albums to me were so exciting because conceptually or intellectually, this is the band trying to make the best version possible of this song, and this is the version that everyone's really going to hear, and it's going to become the reference. So therefore, that's the one I want to be involved with. That's the one I want to work on. And I like that, to me, that was the concept of making something be the best version possible. But that's a different mindset from Steve Albini being a fly on the wall, capturing a moment in time like a historian. And that's a bit more of his approach to music engineering, is to really just capture the culture, capture what's happening. Of course, that requires bands that are performing and are playing live. So we are in a unique time where if musicians are these isolated islands and they're using technology, it's no longer possible to have a live performance because you have one player.
So sad, man. You're breaking me.
Well,
not
everything's a
forever.
pendulum. I don't think anything of the now is here to stay. Didn't mean to bum you out.
Really cool stuff is going to come from this as well. Okay, so when do you start creating Serum or Xfer? Like, how do you? When does that come in?
Hard to stay on the trajectory here. What happened to me a bit was I got a little spoiled in the world of audio engineering. Getting to work for 9 Inch Nails is my first major, well, actually my second major record. My first record was when I was still working at Cutting Edge in San Francisco. I got called to be a Pro Tools op for Mickey Hart, the drummer of the Grateful Dead, on his solo album. And that was an amazing experience. And that was what really made me realize I want to be in the studio. And yeah, that was an incredible experience. Skywalker Sound up in Marin, and just the whole scale of it was amazing. But yeah, after 9 Inch Nails, it's a hard one to follow up, right? How are you going to, Trent's such a musical genius, and I love his aesthetic. Moving to LA, it's few and far between you're going to get those kind of art rock records. I got to work on 2 Perfect Circle records. That was amazing as well, and up my alley. But most of it, when the phone rang, I had to say yes. And some of it would be like pop punk or stuff that wasn't really music I liked. And that became really painful for me, to work 6 weeks on an album, hearing these songs over and over that were just not my kind of music. And of course, hearing it loud too, right? They're trying to listen to it loud. I just started realizing this isn't that fun. I'm not really enjoying myself being in the studio, fixing people's mistakes and hitting record for take 6 and all that stuff. So one particular band, I remember they were like all 18, 19 years old and just nothing very special about them besides nose rings and weird crazy hair. They really couldn't play their instruments too well. And their songs weren't very interesting. And so literally like, okay, take 6 of the drums. And the drummer's doing this like really boring beat. And I was starting to think about, how come we're doing this whole process of recording all these drums so this guy can like try to do this just so I can fix his timing? And I was like, there's got to be a more sensible way. And I had the experience with 9 Inch Nails when we recorded all the multi-track drums, and I said, I wonder if we just did that same idea but just super high resolution, so you'd have like maybe 128 different velocities of each drum, and then preserve all the microphones, so if you want a drier or wetter sound, you can EQ the kick or whatever, you can do all of that stuff later. So literally at that session when it was over, I asked the assistant engineer to go in and hit every drum a couple hundred times, and I went home and chopped them all up. And then I was doing freelance gigs as well as like a programmer, they kind of called it back then. It's, it's not a great name for it, but the guy that kind of makes the beats, right? And some people kind of say producer now, but that's not quite right either for what I was doing, as there was a producer. Anyway, so I got a call to do some music for the end credits to this movie Zoolander. And the band was Powerman 5000, and the movie as a Frankie Goes to Hollywood Relax is like the theme of the movie. So they asked Powerman 5000 if they'd cover Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and we only had 2 days to do it. So given that there's only 2 days in the studio to produce up the song, they decided, there's not time for drums, because drums, you have to tune them all and go through all that stuff. And the singer was sort of like, I kind of wanted a more electronic vibe anyway, so drummer didn't even show up, and Berklee School of Music drummer, by the way. And so I'm programming up this electronic beat, and then it gets to like a pre-chorus that's all kind of metal riff, and they're like, do you have anything that sounds like real drums? And I was like, actually, yeah, I have these samples I've been doing. So I called up like a little mock version of these samples I'd recorded, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's awesome, that sounds pretty good. And the second day the drummer came in, and when it came to that part, he stood up out of his seat and got really angry and looked at everyone. I thought there wasn't time for drums. Who did you get to do drums? And then they're like, no, actually, it's that guy in the corner with his computer. And he was extra mad probably at that point, realizing that he had been replaced by a computer.
So already you're putting Berklee students out of business.
That's right.
Job, so
That's
I
right.
don't know, man. I don't know if
That's
we can
right.
do this podcast.
Putting them back
you
to
don't
work
have, you don't
these
have to
days.
air it. We can finish it just in case you like it. But yeah, so that was when I realized, oh my God, I fooled a Berklee School of Music drummer, because I've always had a lot of respect for Berklee. I've worked from bands with Berklee students like Big Rec, and I actually considered going to Berklee when I was in high school. If it wasn't across the country, I probably would have. And so, yeah, it's hard to get California boy out of California.
That's
but
tough.
Yeah. So then at that point, I was like, I think I have a product here, right? I think this is something that like other guys like me that want to like simulate
Right.
drums are going to really like. So I approached F-Expansion, a company in UK at the NAMM show, and said, hey, I have these drum sounds. I don't know anything about making plugins, but you guys make plugins. Maybe, we could do something here. And so I wasn't even thinking really at the time actually about making its own product. I was looking for a solution for myself to get all these multi-channel files to be a little more organized, because I was using Contact, but I had separate instruments for every microphone and all these key maps, and swapping out a snare for a different snare and all that was a very manual process. So I invited them to my house and played them my samples, and they're like, oh, yeah. Oh, okay, I could imagine you see the drums through the glass and you have a mixer. I was like, oh, like a product? And he's like, yeah, can you record more kits? And I was like, no, these are my kits for me. I just want the software. And then he's like, oh, well, we'll give you a royalty, and do you think you could take photos of the drums? And I'm like, okay, why not? Sure. So I decided, why not? Let's just see what happens. And so I spent, I don't know, a couple weeks or whatever, up to a month maybe, on recording some more drums, chopping them all up, getting them the stuff. And then BFD came out, and it just sold like hotcakes. All of a sudden, I was seeing these royalty checks from it that were bigger than what I was seeing from working on
Yeah.
records. And it's passive income, meaning I'm getting the checks even if I don't do anything. And so I was like, wow, I didn't really expect this. And talking with the programmers and getting into that sort of behind the scenes on the plugin development, I was like, this is so awesome. And I told them, this is so cool. What you guys do is so cool, because it's like, or what we've done is so cool, because you're starting to hear BFD on these car commercials, on Super Bowl ads and stuff like that. And I was like, isn't this cool? We made this thing that like you hear in actual music. Steely Dan used it apparently on something. And he's like, yeah, meta music. And I'm like, what? He's like, meta music, creating the
Is this
tools.
Angus talking to you?
This was Scott McDonald, who's
Okay.
still BFD head. He's like, creating the tool with which a whole bunch of artists each create their own body of work. Thus, you're influencing the entire landscape. And I literally got chills like you do listening to a piece of music up my arms. And I was like, wow, this is what I want to be doing. And I was like, where do I start? And he's like, oh, you mean you want to program? And I was like, yeah. Where do I start? And he's like, I was like, do I go back to college? And he's like, no, just get the SDK from, get Visual Studio from Microsoft, get the VST SDK from Steinberg and just try to get the examples to build. That's where you should start. And I was like, okay. And so literally that next day, that's what I started doing. And so that was sort of where Xfer started from, was me going, I want to make my own stuff. And I just had this vision of maybe someday I can get paid like an actual computer programmer would, you know.
I think we just came up with the title for this podcast. It's going to be Meta Music. That's like, it's got to be Meta Music with Steve Duda. That's amazing. I love that. I love the concept. That's really, it's really amazing.
Exactly.
I also feel, I don't know if this is the case, but FX Expansion software I always felt had a very, very high audio quality level to it. Their synthesizers always felt really well designed to me. I mean, how much did you learn from them in your development of your products, or was it, I got my examples and now I'm doing my own thing?
Well, yeah, my products wouldn't exist without that, and not just experientially, but Andrew Simper, who is now Cytomic, Andrew was the one that made their synthesizers, and he was around in those times, and that's how we became friends. And Andrew's, if anyone's a mentor to me, Andrew's a mentor to me, but that's kind of selling it short because I actually licensed code from him. So his filters, you know, are the filters in LFO Tool and in Serum are Andrew's student filters from when he was just learning DSP stuff, and they sound better than, you know, most commercial stuff. And so similarly, Andrew licenses to Ableton, and all the filters in Ableton Live are all Andrew's work as well. So,
and the glue compressor,
he doesn't get enough credit. You know, people give me credit for stuff, but Andrew is probably more influential in a way sonically in terms of signal generation or things going through things. He's more influential on the last decade than anyone, I think. So
you were just like influential in general. What are you saying?
Well, you know, in terms of the DSP, right? Like in terms about like whose math has sculpted signals the most in the last 10 years, and I'd say that's Andrew. Wow. It's, you know, maybe subtleties, right? Like maybe if he didn't exist, the music would still exist, but it would just be a little different, whatever. But not terribly so much the case. So Andrew's, what I learned from watching him and his attention to math and quality, it made me realize like what's really necessary if you're going to be like a DSP guy, and especially for his sort of interest, which is component modeling and virtual analog stuff. And so he went back and got a degree in electrical engineering just so he could figure out the intent behind circuits, not just the circuit itself. And so, without the experience of Scott and Angus and watching them kind of have that company doing its thing and how this sort of team works, I wouldn't have been able to imitate it in the way that I did. I basically mimicked what they did as a group alone by cutting corners, right? By licensing instead of hiring, or by doing as good as I can, or just doing my own support, or, you know, et cetera, doing my own artwork, or asking a friend to do the artwork, like Deadmau5 did the graphics for Nerve and LFO Tool, or I co-opted his graphics from Nerve for LFO Tool. But, he was a graphic designer before a DJ musician, so I was like, hey, you want to make a knob image for me, you know, or whatever.
I've been watching his live stream of how he's modeling his cube and his performance. Amazing. I feel the same kind of generosity from you that I do from him. He's like just letting so much of his process out there, and I was amazed when go for it.
No, I agree. I think it's really cool that he shares stuff, and you know, it's kind of interesting because I think people often imitate what inspires them in a certain sense. Yes. And for Joel, he was a Flash developer and graphic designer before he was a musician, and there was this Flash developer who was, you know, I remember Joel telling me this when he was like 17 or so, and he was like, yeah, there's this Flash guy, and he's like all tatted, and he smokes, and he swears a lot. He's so fucking cool, and he like streams himself doing Flash. And then you fast forward to today, and this is exactly what Joel grew into, like smoking and tattoos, swearing a lot, and like being the cool guy that he looked up to. Now he's kind of trying to imitate that for other people. I would argue he'd probably disagree with my psychoanalysis of it, but
Well, it's pretty cool that Deadmau5 did your graphics.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe we should start talking about the tech a little bit more.
Yeah.
So, like a lot of the conversations that we have and the people that we talk to is like at this sort of direct intersection of creativity and technology and innovation and, blurring those lines in a way. So, you make what is a relatively technical product, but it allows a lot of creativity and expression. So, like, how creative is your process as a developer, and then how technical is your process when you're making music? Like, where do those lines sort of meet or blur in your own process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really interesting, and it's something that I've kind of, it's popped into my head, of course, over the years. Whether making music or programming, you'll think of the other. So there's a lot of interesting parallels between musician and developer. You can, of course, be very technical as a musician, and there's no promise that you'll be successful, even with a high level of technical expertise. I mean, I kind of touched on it earlier. It's like a natural ambition to be best at something, and that's kind of something I relate to a bit. It's, a lofty target, of course, to try to be best. But I remember when I was 15, 16, working at a music store, there was this kind of glam rock guitar player, and every lunch he would just sit there and scales and arpeggios just up and down the fretboard. That's all he'd do his whole lunch, and it seemed like such a work type thing. And then he kind of was lamenting to me. He's like, what sucks about music? Like, for instance, in tennis, if you want to be number one, all you have to do is beat the top player, and then you're number one. But it's not that way in music. And obviously that's like not the greatest way to think about music, but it's interesting that there's sort of that technical mindset that you can try to apply, but that leaves you short from making something that people are necessarily going to really cherish. You're kind of off from what the kind of meat of music is. So so it's almost maybe laughable in a way. But or you can think about a creative expression, maybe contrarily, should be something that's really unique. But anyway, it's an interesting concept that I think a lot of musicians can really relate to, because the idea of popular music, this whatever is popular, being so hinged on the tastes of the masses, sort of the fad and fashion of culture, and then not necessarily appreciating their more finessed, more like crafted, sort of sophisticated form of expression that they've made as musicians, that they've developed as musicians. So this is something that I've, sort of heard various muso types, of course, lament over for a long time. So anyway, back to like creator tools, making the software, it can be viewed similarly, I think, which is that, for instance, I'm by no means the best programmer by far. I'm not the most technical or the most knowledgeable there. I didn't go to school for programming. Almost everything I know is from my own studying and tinkering, which has left gaps in my knowledge. Yet somehow I have one of the top software in music production that's out there. And while I can't dismiss timing and luck and those sorts of things, having the right product at the right time is kind of what it's all about in music or software. And I got there because of my experience as a musician, of course. It's like the design side of it is what really is made the difference. It's not really anything specific about the code, I would say. I followed my gut instincts, you could say, and my gut instincts resonated with other people. And this reminds me of pop music. For instance, Zed is a good friend of mine, and Zed just has had a string of pop hits, and he just follows his instincts because his instincts are pop sensible. It's just what he likes. When I met him, and he was 20 or so, and an unknown name, and he was like, "Yeah, I want to blend EDM and pop music," and saying it almost like it sounded so naive. Yet, I kind of believed in him. I was like, "Go for it, for sure." But he did exactly what he set out to do, and he's just used his own litmus and his own compass to guide him to that. So I think there's something to be said for whatever, if you just happen to have tastes that resonate with other people, I guess.
And those are the type that aren't imitating. It's honest, and it just lined up with what other people love.
Yeah, I mean, you see people complain about pop music as being formulaic and derivative, and they talk about it like they could just do it in a second, but it's beneath them. It's like, well, go for it. Why turn down?
Do it.
Yeah, why turn down that $1 million check? Just do it. Do it. I mean, if you don't want the million, you can give that to me, and you'll have the hit. But if it's so easy, just do it. So it's something that I've come to realize that a lot of, and I understand that thinking because I was there too, but I've realized that most pop producers, they actually like pop music.
Right.
You had
Gotta
some.
be honest.
You
Have to be
reacted,
honest.
Loudon, to something Steve said about the code. You had some sort of a physical reaction. I want to know what you were thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying your code isn't great, or that wasn't the reason why maybe Serum is so popular, but for me, I use a lot of software, and I always feel like when I'm using a soft synth or it's always like a conversation with the developer. That's what I enjoy the most about it. It's we have these set of tools that are standard. It's an envelope, it's an LFO, it's an oscillator. Yeah. And so that's like a common language, but then there's all this subtext and there's all this questioning. Well, why'd they make this one choice? Why'd they make this choice? Like I can hear, like, as you I'm sure do, the differences in filters, why'd they choose that filter, and I can kind of guess at, well, they're prioritizing, say, audio fidelity over processing power, and there's all these interesting little choices being made, and
yeah.
I think there's a reason in the code, and I think the same thing you're saying about deadmau5 and Zed, in that you're following your instincts, but your instincts have found a path that I think is weighted toward the audio fidelity side, over anything else. I notice a bit of that with Strobe as well, the synthesizer, and that there's a clarity to things, and there's like maybe a higher resolution to the control side of things, so I don't notice little issues when we're moving envelopes fast. But my conversation with you has always been, you're doing exactly what I want to hear, right? And it always seems to sound right to me. And I think that is, my guess is why Serum has worked out so well. I mean,
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I guess the disparity between what you're saying, I mean, thanks for the compliment, and I'll take it. It's that when I'm saying that I'm not the greatest coder, it's that I didn't code the oscillators for Serum. I didn't code the filters for Serum. Oscillators and filters are a large portion of a synthesizer, right? So you could argue that I didn't code Serum in a sense, right? So for instance, it's slightly tangential, but on point, when I finished Serum, I was very proud of it. I did type over 1 million keystrokes, not counting all the ones I deleted, and so hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and a lot of sweat and tears went into that. And then I had my laptop, went up to visit my brother, and like I said, he's a computer programmer ace, so I was very, very proud of it. And not that he's in audio or synthesizers or anything, but I was like, I finished my synthesizer, and he's like, that's cool. And I was like, yeah, check out the source code or something. And I kind of opened, or no, that was actually a different product. He said, oh, cool. Well, how did you code the oscillators? And I was like, oh, I didn't. I licensed them.
That's an older brother for you. Just gonna find the one thing.
Oh, he wasn't even trying to rib me. He was genuinely curious.
Yeah.
But he was like, well, how did you code the oscillators? I was like, oh, well, I licensed them. I tried for like a month. And he's like, oh, so you were more of the designer then? And I was like, at first it was like, ouch. And then I was like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm more of the designer. I mean, I really put these pieces, the headiest math I didn't do myself. Obviously, it's not that I don't know what I'm doing at all, or I would have never gotten it working, or been able to address every crash and issue that comes along and all of that. So you have to know some stuff. It's just that math has never been my specialty, much to the chagrin of my calculus teacher mom. I've never even taken calculus. But yeah, that's just not where my that's not where my qualities, I think, lay. It's not that I maybe couldn't do it. It's just that I don't have any interest in it. And I've always followed my interests. I want to do what's cool and what's fun. Obviously, work's work, and never is it always going to all be fun. But it's just I can't read a book on C++ or anything like that without just going numb, and just putting it down. I'll have to read a page 4 times because I'll realize I'm not even reading the words or whatever. I'm just I have a very hard time with some certain things like that. But I've learned enough. I have designed some filters myself, and it's always about, to me, I have to really be interested in wanting to explore that frontier, or else I'm just not going to be able to continue at it.
It feels a lot like composition to me in a way.
Yeah.
Where or you're offloading certain technical tasks so you can be creative, and their one hand is holding the other. But even with composition, everything's somewhat derivative, right? And that we're all just making variations on themes in a way. So it just, your process reminds me a lot of my compositional process, frankly.
Right, great. Yeah, that makes sense. I can, yeah, I can definitely relate to that as well from the music side. Um,
Okay. Okay, what do you think is going on? Like, who's making cool stuff? What does Steve Duda think is cool?
I mean, I guess you have products and you have companies, and I mean, I think Ableton Live would be the one that would satisfy both of those for me, in the sense that they have a cool product, and then they have this culture that they've kind of created. You know, they don't have this sort of profit at all costs kind of mindset that seems like a lot of companies sort of have. They seem to care about community, care about culture, care about education, and they try to do that slightly more conscious thing. And so that's very inspiring to me. And if I ever grow Xfer to a size where I can do things like that, I definitely want to. So I think that they're doing a cool job. They're doing a good job with their success. And then overall, I'd say I don't like to look at what other people do too closely in a way. I mean, if someone does something particularly well, it's sort of a relief to me because it makes me feel like, well, I don't have to go explore that, or that's sort of like, that's sort of cool. What it really inspires me and gets me going is the unexplored, and it's that feeling, and it's similar in composition or something. It's like, I don't want to know that someone's used the same string of notes. I'd rather feel like I've just used them for the first time, or something like that. It's that even though we never can be as original as we want to, I strive for exploring the unexplored. If the world wasn't completely mapped out now, I'd probably want to be out there on a boat trying to find some island that no one knows about, but can't do that. So, we can explore technology because there's, I mean, huge areas of stuff that's all on the cutting edge or the unexplored in music and in software. So, yeah, that's where I'm most excited by. In terms of cool stuff, I mean, to me right now, the coolest stuff is happening on the research side of stuff, like all the OpenAI music experiments that are going on, and all this stuff I find the most fascinating because the research world tends to give you a glimpse into maybe what might be coming for consumers down the road a bit, and it just takes people to be able to bridge that gap between, find a utilitarian function for certain things or whatnot. So yeah, I can't really think of too many other companies that come to mind right now.
Have you been messing with any of the Google Magenta stuff or like the Isotope stuff in terms of the AI software?
Not as much as I should because I'm interested in all. I check it all out. Like I check out examples and I kind of try to keep up with the technology and what's happening. I haven't really tinkered with it all too much myself. Full disclosure, I have a partner of sorts that I'm doing some back and forth with on spitballing ideas, and he's an AI expert. So I kind of stay out of that in terms of my own sphere. I'm most interested in it from a black box perspective a bit, in terms of just being able to understand what's possible or not. And so I'd like to dive more in, but yeah, I haven't gotten the time to really get too hands-on with it.
We had a really interesting conversation with the CTO of Isotope, and he gave us like the whole rundown about AI and what it is they're doing, and it is just totally fascinating. So maybe there's a Xfer AI product in the future, is what you're telling us?
There's going to be AI in everything. I mean, it's part of our lives from here on out. It's so yes, absolutely. It's, to me, it's kind of twofold. It's like, it's not something I want to do as a gimmick. It's something I want to do when it's truly useful. And also back to what I was saying about previously about exploring the unexplored. I'm not terribly interested in using it in the same way that other people are using it, although there may be some of that where it makes sense. But I'm interested in finding new uses for AI and trying to explore that. So that's what me and a partner are working on right now, is just sort of a pet project. It may become Xfer stuff, or it may become a separate company, or it may just be something free we make. Not really sure right now, but yeah, I'm very excited about it. AI is definitely sort of fad of the moment in a sense, yet it's not like a VR type fad to me. I mean, I think it's really something that's here to stay, and it's gonna, it's already directly benefiting our lives with, letting me dictate an email or whatnot. So,
Gotta love that.
definitely.
So you earlier you mentioned growing Xfer Records, and to me it's interesting because I was amazed that every time I've ever emailed you with a support question, and that's our first relationships have actually been my emailing you about licenses or about specifics about Serum. It's always been you that gets back to me fast. And so I have had this impression that Xfer Records is you, and that you care about your customers. And I can imagine that growing a company in that situation would be a very difficult thing. Or I even wonder, is that really a goal? What?
Yeah, I might care about my customers too much, arguably. I've answered email every day for the last 5 years without a day off, including vacations, and it drives my wife crazy, whatever. Like, come on, we're on vacation. Why are you answering emails? Well, someone has to answer them, and I don't want to come home to 5,000. And so
you can hire other people to do that.
You can hire other people. That's right. But
Yeah.
that brings its own dilemmas, right? So I've put that off as long as possible because it's not so much a time issue. I'm like, I got this. I can handle this. An hour a day, whatnot. It's not really the time that's the problem. Obviously, people appreciate hearing from me, and it cools down some angry emails really quick sometimes, especially a quick turnaround where they get a reply in 5 minutes or whatever. So I take pride in it, and I feel like it would be very hard to find people that would live up to that same level of support. Obviously, people aren't going to be able to know the software as well as I. If I can, so it's a tough thing to replace. The problem is that it has become a psychological factor where waking up to 20 problems every morning, every day of your life without a break is sort of gets you fatiguing, and the software is starting to suffer from it, right? So should I care about my customers for the few that have a problem, or should I care about the customers who are happy and want to see a new feature or a new update or a new product? And so I'm realizing that I probably should start offloading some of that just for my own mental space, so I can really start thinking about keeping the products moving and not feeling like I'm being productive just by answering emails. So that's kind of where it's gotten to. But as I said, I don't really consider myself one of the best programmers. So there's a lot of space there for me to also offload some of that stuff. And that's what I've been doing lately. I hired a programmer, Eyal Amir, who's a X-Waves junior developer. And Eyal is just amazing musician. Great guy to work with, and he has experience and understanding that I never got, because I never got to watch other people make plugins, or much less a large company like Waves make plugins. And so he's doing everything properly for the rebuilds, essentially. I mean, just to be future-proof, basically everything has to get rewritten, and not the DSP necessarily and stuff like that. So things can sound the same, but everything, all the behind the scenes for what you see and the interaction with the operating system and all that. To be able to get to, say, iOS or mobile, or to be able to get to web, or any of that stuff, all this stuff has to get rewritten. And then plus there's wanting to make future stuff. So more and more now I want to find the most talented people and work with them. And it's, to me, really about the result. I don't need to earn more money, or I don't need to grow Xfer for ego reasons. It really comes back to the meta music, or being able to make tools that excite people, because one of the biggest surprises with Serum has been the amount of thank you type of emails I've gotten, which is something I've never seen from previous plugins. I've seen people excited by things, but never this like, you've changed my music or made my music possible, or that kind of a thing, is amazing. And so I want to be able to say, hey, maybe that's my real strength, considering I didn't do the oscillator, this or that. Maybe it was the design and figuring out what's the kind of thing that I feel like I can be creative in. And the limitations in Serum are pretty directly related to my limitations as a programmer. I would have loved to have, much more sophisticated effects chains and this or that, and be able to run multiple ones of an effect, or lots of stuff. I can think of stuff all over the board that could have I just thrown some money at someone, it would exist in Serum. And so there's a lot of stuff deferred for Serum too, and all of that.
That's interesting. At the same time, I think those limitations you had have made a very approachable synthesizer.
Yes.
One of the reasons I've loved it, and I had the same impact working with Native Instruments Massive, is it's easy to teach, in that there are the structure of the signal flow. It is just what's necessary. Like it's been refined down to a really good musical need, and we don't have all this extra stuff. Like when I try to teach Massive X, I'm lost because all the signal flow positive, all these other things that might get you an interesting result, make it really tough to teach and to learn. I think one of the huge benefits of Serum is that there are only one of each of those effects. I can't instantiate 1,000 of them. I can move their order, and I can get awesome musical results with them. I have certain options in signal flow. It's really what's necessary. And, I really would like the ability to put just that sub oscillator outside of the effects, because that's one thing that I need all the time musically. That one direct out button is there. And so everything, and that's what I mean about the conversation with you that I've been having over the last 15 years that you haven't known about, has been like, okay, yes, things are where I need them, and I can teach this easily. It's and so there's I think that tells something about those limitations maybe you have were a huge benefit. They led to the right choices.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's really, it was, Serum was an interesting one for me design-wise, because I really started with this sort of thesis, I guess you could say. I mean, the primary motivation was I want to make my synth because I haven't made a synth. So it was really that simple, of that, that mountain you haven't climbed yet kind of a thing. It was the next logical step after doing Nerve with sample playback. It's like, okay, I'm really right there against the edge of a synthesizer. So it was really, I want to make a synth. And then similar to sit down, like if you're just like, I want to make a piece of music or something like that, you have to start putting constraints on it. You can't, you're not going to, you can just sort of start randomly flailing and see what happens. But I started thinking like, well, what kind of synth do I want to make? And then it became, like I was saying earlier, if someone's really done something well, I'm not interested in doing that so much. Like, I don't want to be the budget Massive, or I don't want to be the,
Right.
You know what I mean? That's not inspiring to me at all, to be like, I'll just do what they did and charge half the price and it'll be worse. But like that just doesn't interest me, even if there's a market for that or whatnot. It's like, no, I want to do something that like is really putting power into the people's hands, where they're like, I couldn't do this and now I can, and this is awesome, right? So that's as simple as I can kind of explain my motivation in software. And so my thinking there was really to form an opinion of, it was really based around making a programmable synth, making a synth that I want to make sounds on. Because there's all these synths, we all have all these soft synths, there's tons of them out there, and they all have presets. But when it comes to like init and making a sound and having it being used in the song, or even just to sit there and say, make a bank of patches, I found myself so uninspired by Massive. I was just like, it's just ugly-ish, or like
visually.
I can't see exactly, I can't get my idea. I have an idea for how I want the LFO to go, but nope, not that shape, nope, not that shape, and I can't. So it was all these, like, so Serum is really a culmination of that sort of intent of like, I want the synth that's fun to make sounds on. And then a lot of the eye candy that's in Serum is for that reason as well, as me thinking like, well, I want it to be fun. So when you turn unison, you see unison. It's not good enough just for it to be a number box. And so those subtleties, if you will, really, I think people really react to them. And I've learned it's really worth the time to go outside of what's necessary to provide some of that aesthetic.
That's Loudon's favorite parameter, is unison.
Oh my God! Yeah, I mean, how can it be?
Yeah, exactly.
And what's weird is that I know that.
Yeah.
I know what his favorite parameter on your synth is.
Yeah, unison, and then delay in general is my other favorite thing.
The
Yeah,
students,
of
it's
course.
easy for them to pick it up too. It's like, yes, it's an easier tool
get
to
it.
teach,
Yeah.
but I mean, I'm a person that gravitates towards like a less is more sort of tech, and I don't want to have a synthesizer with 40 different patch points. I just don't.
Yeah.
I want like 5 or 6, and that makes me feel powerful. Like, and I just can't deal with, like when you were saying about having trouble with Massive visually, that's my issue with it as well, is that I just couldn't I couldn't even get into it because of the visual component.
Yeah, you feel a little removed from the signal flow, as we were talking about signal flow. And of course, if you learn, you can say, hey, it's a powerful tool, and it was ahead of its time, and it was hugely influential, and Serum probably wouldn't exist in its form without Massive. But yeah, it's lacking certain visuals. The 3D wavetables in Serum directly come from the fact that you don't see the wavetable in Massive, and that frustrated me. You load
Any
a
number.
wavetable.
There are no numbers. What is the actual frequency of my
What is
filter cutoff?
What is my attack time? Is it 1 second or 12? I don't
It's
know.
just this much.
Yeah.
It's this much.
Yeah. So definitely frustrated me. Like I couldn't see the wavetables. Does this contain 4 frames or is it like 100? I don't know. And I can't even tell if I'm set right on one of them, et cetera. And so, just all the thing. And I want to make my own wavetable, et cetera, et cetera. So everything that I did was really based not on like, hey, what's going to sell. Arguably people weren't like just waiting with their wallets open to generate wavetables, or something like that. But it was the stuff that I wanted to make. And so it was sort of like, this is my synth that I would want to use because I have that experience being in the studio enough that's all of those things. And it did start with a list of gripes from other synthesizers. And then obviously on the contrary, the best of from various synthesizers, like, oh, I love that in that synth or that in that synth. And so, of course, just like with music and influences, you cobble a bit from your influences.
And you chose the best oscillators.
You did a good
job. You chose the best filters, right? So earlier when I'm just thinking back to you saying that you didn't code the oscillators. Yeah, but there's lots of choices there to be made, and you chose the best ones, or the ones that were most appropriate for this.
That's right, and slightly tangential. This is something that I've thought of a number of times when you see music releases and the artist name is not actually on the release. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but like DJ so-and-so, yet they hired someone to make the song, and they found a singer, and they got in the studio together, and maybe this guy said, oh yeah, I like that, do that. But he didn't really do anything on the music, right? And yet the guy who actually built up the beat, his name's not even on it. Why is the artist name this DJ? And is that unfair? And I actually take the controversial viewpoint that it's not unfair. In fact, that DJ deserves it because he was the entrepreneur that got that guy, paid that guy to make that beat. He found that singer, got that singer in on that track, created this synergy, made this thing that would have never existed without him. And so maybe some people aren't quite getting their fair credit, but I think he definitely deserves his name on it because he made it happen. And so, yeah, similarly, I feel that same kind of credit with Serum. It's like, yeah, I can't take credit for the oscillators. And people say, oh, dude, your oscillator sounds so freaking good. I'm like, yeah, it's Laurent Desoris from Ohmforce, and you should check out their stuff too.
That's the curation is the new creativity in a way.
I mean, if you took the other approach, then your name would have to be on millions of releases right now. So, so there's that. No, there's something I've been dying to ask you. I think that you're saying meta music. Your tools have changed music, have defined a lot of, maybe not defined, but they've influenced. People exploring your tool has created certain sounds. And certain music exists because you make that. How do you feel being that person, and how do you reflect on that at all?
Well, it's interesting because, keep in mind that I come from being a musician background first and using these tools and understanding that intimacy that you develop as a musician with these tools. You can love them like children or whatnot, right? And so there's a certain thing that I felt back then, which was that the programmers of these tools must have some sort of pride and connection to the output from these tools. It's such a logical thing. And so I developed a software, it's weird software. I didn't develop it. I had some ideas that I farmed out to a developer, and he took those ideas and turned them into something well beyond my ideas. It was this software called Divine Machine. And Divine Machine, it was this loop workstation, loop manipulator. And so I got of course a preview copy and made some piece of music with it, and I sent it to the programmer, and I asked him, how does this make you feel to hear this piece of music that was entirely made in your software. Like, that must feel really great, you know, or something. And he's like, honestly, Steve, I don't feel anything. You know, that's your music. You made the decisions that made that music. It wasn't me. And I thought that was so weird. Like, why is he being so humble? Like, no, dude, come on, be a little proud. And like, this wouldn't exist without you. Like, be proud that you did this. But now I totally understand his point, which is that other people made the aesthetic judgment to use my software. And they found a certain filter setting. Oh, this reverb filter, and we'll make this rhythm genre using this reverb filter. It has nothing, in a sense, to do with me. I made decisions, but it was them that made the aesthetic of how to apply those effects creatively, and for them to make this genre of music with all the moving parts that create a sound. So on one sense, it feels good to get the recognition, but on the other sense, I struggle between feeling like an imposter when people say this about me, and it's hard to take credit, but I'm definitely at the same time very proud, because I know just the fact that people are using it that's like proof to me. And so it doesn't go anything beyond that to me. It's like they have other options. If they want to use other options, they can use those. So that's the truest, purest compliment to me, is to use my stuff.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I think that's a really fantastic place to maybe end the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, and
thank you, Steve.
taking the
So
time out
awesome.
of your day and responding to emails so quickly.
Of course. Speaking of, I guess I'll go do some of those now.